This is a screencast about why you would want to write and how you will write functions in PHP. I'm going to first of all sort of say why a function, writing functions is a good idea and how to do it. And then I'm going to give you an example of how to write in a function something that would maybe display a menu on a web page. And then if I've got time in this video, I'll also show you how you might do a function to produce a select box, which is something you frequently have to do. If this video starts to get a bit long, then I'll break that into a second video as a part 2. Okay, state the obvious first of all. What is a function? Well, a function is a named block of code, and really it should do one task only. It shouldn't do more than one task, because that makes it more likely to be reusable. It should also be unaware of its environment. So in other words, if a function needs to, if you're going to validate something that you got from the input stream, from the request or the post or the get, the function itself shouldn't access the request or the post or the get. Those should just be values passed into the function, and the function would then just do the validation and return. That would make the function much more flexible. So it should do one task only. It should be unaware of its environment. I've not added that in my little aid memoir here. Unaware of environment. It should return a value. Okay. So in other words, a function shouldn't do any echoing, for instance. It should assemble a string and return the string, so that the place where you call it from, the client, can echo it if it needs to. Again, it makes the function more reusable, because maybe you want to gather some information and you don't want to echo it. Maybe you want to email it to someone instead. Whereas if you've echoed that inside the function, then the function is really effectively limited in the way it can be reused. And then the real power of a function is in that it can accept parameters, and it uses those parameters to behave differently according to circumstance. All of the built-in functions that you know do that. You know, you pass a string to something to trim it, or you pass a string to something to find out what the leftmost character is, etc., etc. And it's much better to use a function than just simply to use included bits of code. And that's because the variables inside functions are scoped to the function, and they don't kind of spill out over the rest of your code. For an example, this bit of code, username equals checking if the thing is in the request stream using ternary of structure is set, then if it is set, then we take what's in the request stream and store it into the username, else we store the null into username. And then we include a database connection file, and we move on to here. So what at this point do you think the password equals? Well, looking at the code, it would be obvious to think, well, the password equals what I got out the request stream. But that's not necessarily the case, because what would happen if in my DB connection I'd got something like this, where I set a username and a password. Obviously your password would be slightly more secure than that, and then you connect to the database. You know, whether you're using MySQLi or whether you're using PDO or whatever you do, you've defined these two variables, and these two variables, because they're the same as the variables that you've got from the request stream, suddenly this variable doesn't equal what you got from the request stream, it equals what was defined inside here, and you can't figure out why your code breaks. And then there's another kind of side effect, is that later on in your code you might end up referring to $con, and someone looking at your code thinks, well, where on earth did $con come from, because it's not declared anywhere visibly. And that's because it's declared, except I call it connection, it's declared inside that included file, but it's not obvious from outside here. So first of all, then, we don't really want variables that are not obviously visible, and we don't want something happening in include file to stomp all over variables that we thought were safe here. So a much better way would be to take this code and enclose it inside a variable, and I mean that would be the easiest thing in the world to do. So normally what I do is I keep all of my functions in one file, because the whole point of this is that they're reusable, so I'm going to be able to use them in multiple places. So to write a function in PHP, you just write the keyword function, the name of the function, and this one's going to make a connection, so I'm going to call it get connection. I always tend to do this, a verb of some description, and then what the verb's acting upon. So in this case it's getting a connection rather than setting a connection. It's going to retrieve something. At the minute I don't need to pass a parameter because I'm going to use it in one context, but I might have passed a DNS string to define what database I want to connect to if I wanted to reuse it. But at the moment, this suffices as an example that I'm doing that. So in here I've defined a username and a password, but they're not going to spill out anywhere, and then whether you're using MySQLi or whether you're using PDO or some other method, at this point we've now got this connection variable, so I could just simply return that connection variable. Okay, I mean, the clever amongst you will probably realize I didn't actually need a variable. I could have just returned new PDO, or I could have just returned MySQLi connect. And again, I'm explaining how to use functions. Normally you might put this in a try-catch construct, but that's outside the scope of this. So now I've written get connection, so how would I use that? If I go back to my plan, I now wouldn't use include, because include, if it doesn't work, only throws a warning. I'd use require, and I wouldn't, because the thing I'm requiring, so I might change that actually. Let me just go use of demo functions, that's a good place to do it. So now, rather than include that, I'm going to start again and make that require once. Require, first of all, throws an error if it can't find the file, not a warning, and that's useful. And require once will, if the file has already been included or required somewhere else, it won't bother getting it again, and that's important when you're defining functions, because otherwise you'd get an error saying duplicate function definition. So I've required once that file that contains this function, get connection. And then all I need to do is write whatever my variable is equals get connection, and that function will return a value which I can store into a variable. Obviously the variable here doesn't need to be named the same as the variable here. That's irrelevant, because this is a little world that the variables here are completely independent of the variables in the outside world. So now I've got two advantages. I've not stomped over the top of these variables, and also it's much more explicit that I've got a variable called con and where it came from. Okay, so that's example number one. Much better to use require once and a function rather than just including a bit of PHP code. Okay, example number two. This is something that's been in the workshop tasks on the university course, if you're following this video because of that. So this is, my name's there, but in actual fact I didn't author this code as part of your course code. So here, what are we doing? We've got a simple function that makes a navigation menu. We pass in something called nav menu header, and then we're setting up a variable that equals this string. This is what's known as a here doc, and it's much easier to use rather than enclosing in quotes when you've got a long string that itself might contain quotes of different sorts. The only thing to note is that whatever your starter word is there, you must end that with the same word, and that end must be against the margin. You can't indent that. If you indent it, it doesn't work. Okay, so I've got that, and I could use it in some way. In fact, let's just put that into place, and so you can see it demoed. I'll move that out. I'll take that which I've got and I'll paste it inside my web functions. So I'll just add it to the bottom of that, because this is usually what happens. This is usually what happens, is you have a file, that web functions I've called it, and it's full of different functions. So let's just see that work. So use demo functions, I'm going to require once web functions, and then I can simply echo, what was it called? forgotten what it was called, make nav menu. And I need to pass in some header, so role demo functions. So if I save that, go to my browser and demo use functions, it's done that web and placing the header at the top as you would expect. So let's just look at that code. We've got this simple make menu, a parameter comes in. By the way, when you define the function, these are known as parameters, and when you call the function, that is called an argument, if we want to be formal about it. So here I'm defining a string. That variable that's passed in, I can embed inside this string, and then I'm listing this list of menus. So that seems fairly good. And I'm effectively now concatenating the string and just returning that string, which is why here I'm just echoing what that returns, and this returns a string. So straightforward, but not really very flexible, because this menu is kind of built into the function, so it doesn't sound as though it's going to be very reusable. So what's happening here, look, is we've got a set of lists, a set of links, and they would lend themselves to being inside an array, and I could iterate through the array. So what's different on that line there to that line there? Well, the URL I pass and the description. So it might be much better if I could use this function in a different way. So maybe I could make up something called menu choices that equals an array. And it's an associative array where I can pass in a value, so index.php, and that's going to have so that's the key, and then this is the associated value with that of home page. And then the next element in my array might be contact.php, and that's given a value of contact us, etc. And I could do a whole set of different values in there. And then when I call make menu, I not only pass the thing that I want to be the header, but I could also pass the menu choices that I've just created. That will be much more flexible, because then in the client could define any set of menus they want, and my code would become more reusable. So how am I going to implement that then? Well, inside my web functions, I'm not going to have this bit of code. I'm going to put that inside an iteration of some description. So the end of that string, instead of being there, I'll move it up to, let me put it about there. And for the time being, we'll just accept that that's shown me lots of errors. Actually, no, we won't accept that. I'll just move it out of the way. So I'm just going to cut that and place it there so we can look at that and use that as our kind of model. So I need to add an extra parameter that's going to be called here. So, and I might as well call it links or choices or menus, or menu, in fact, no, menus. So what have I got? I've set up a variable called that, which equals now just that part here, and then after I've defined what that string is, I'm going to have to do something. So let me write some pseudocode for what I'm going to do. I should probably check if the menu is an array. Is an array. Then I might well want to iterate through the array, and I want to display the link and the text. So that will be the end of the iterate, and that will be the end of the check if array. Okay, so that's my plan. I always tend to write a plan and then I can put the code underneath. So if is array, my my thing that I've called menus. Open a brace, and I'll close the brace where my comment is. So if that thing is an array, and actually I can try and help that it should be an array by using type hinting and saying that that argument must be an array, but I could give it a default value, so if necessary people don't have to pass something, though that might not make a lot of sense, but still I'm still doing that. So if it's an array, I'm going to iterate through the array. So best thing to use is a for each, because that's the most flexible for iterating through arrays, and my array is called menus, so menus as, and then normally it's some variable, and what that does is iterate through the array, pulling out each element in turn as var. So let me just finish this structure. Okay, so what that'll do is go through this and pull out the first element, which is that, and then it'll pull out the second element, which is that, which is great when it's a numeric array, but in this instance it's an associative array. So the best way to do that is to pull out the key, in other words that would be the URL, and then using the same kind of language that you used to when you made the array in the first place, and a value. So what that'll do is pull out in turn that part, the key or the index of the associative array, and then that part as the value of that key or index. So that would be a better way to do it, except my key is really a URL, so I might as well name it appropriately. So that's a URL, and then this is like the descriptor of some description, so I'm just going to call it desk for descriptor. Okay, and now I've got to display the link and the text. So I've got this model down here, look, so I could, I need to, I'm not going to echo it, I need to add it onto a string. Well, actually I've already got a string on the go here called nav menu content. So let's make it nav menu content dot equals, that's the same as saying nav menu content equals nav menu content dot, because the dot is the concatenation operator in PHP, and what that equals is li a href, I can get up there, equals in quotes my variable URL, then my descriptor, and then close the A and close the link, semicolon. So I'm going to loop around, it will add that to that string, it'll finally add a new line to the source, and it'll just return it. So there is a mistake in this code at the minute because I've got this UL part that I've not included. Oh, and the end nav which I took away. So before I start to iterate through the loop, maybe what I should do is take that nav menu content and add to it the UL part of it. So UL, and then at the end of my loop, what I should do is add to nav menu content. This time I'll use double quotes, and I'll explain why I've done something different in a moment. So it was the UL and the end nav part, because if you remember I cut that out as well from that string up there. So let's remove that. And let's see what mistakes I've made, because undoubtedly I've made some. I never managed to get away scot-free. So, so far so good. Let's reload this page, and seems to work okay. It's shown us two things. Let's view source. I mean, obviously I've not put in a doc type and a heading, and you would obviously need to do that. Because otherwise it wouldn't be legal code. But look, it's all on one line, and that's not very helpful when you're syntax checking, because if you get a syntax error and it says error on line 2, it's not going to really be very good. So I want to break these onto new lines. So let's go back to the source code, and here I've got this nav menu header, but when I want to put that on a new line, I could prefix it with \n. Again, I'm including an error here, which you'll see on your screen. So \n, 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 and \n is a new line in the source. So when I save that, refresh the source, we'll see it's put things onto a new line, all except this one here, look, where it's actually literally displayed \n. And that's because double quotes in PHP you use if you want to interpolate a variable. In other words, I use double quotes there because it contains a variable, and double quotes will interpolate that variable. In other words, not display the literal string $URL, $desk, but it'll show what their values are. And that's also true of \ns. So where I use single quotes, the \ns didn't work correctly, whereas now they do. Actually, I could do with those LIs being tabbed in. So where I've got an LI there, \t will cause the source to be tabbed in, so it formats it nicely, okay, or more nicely. The reason that's popping out is because this is tabbed in over here. I would imagine if I do that, then it might display a bit better in the source, and it does. So maybe that should be like that, perhaps, or maybe I'd actually want to put \t's in front of all that. You get the point. Okay, so far so good then. We've got now a function that will make headers and a menu much more flexibly. So in other words, I could add some extra options to this, some Perl.php products. Save that, and when I refresh the page, it automatically creates that appropriately, and as you can see at the bottom of the screen, the URL is changing appropriately. So that was a good use of a function. Okay, thanks very much indeed. I'll make the other part 2 about how we might do something similar to create select boxes.